Okay, good morning. Today's daf is daf Yud Bet in Masechet Zevachim. We are at the Mishnah on Yud Aleph Amud Bet. So let me share my screen and we will get started. Um, in the opening Mishnah of our Masechet, the Tanakama said that a Pesach korban offered with another sacrifice in mind. So again, it's Erev Pesach. Let's note before we give a time to it. You bring the korban Pesach. We'll ignore the date at the moment, but instead of thinking that you're bringing a korban Pesach, when you slaughter the animal, when you receive the blood, when you do any of those steps, you have in mind a shlamim, or you have in mind a chatas, or you have in mind an ola. So we said that it is invalid if you do that, but we limited it to saying that that's only when it's done in the proper time for a Pesach. When not offered not in the proper time, a Pesach offered with another sacrifice in mind turns into a valid shlamim. Now, a Pesach in general, the majority view, we'll see that there's going to be a different view that we get today, but a Pesach can only be offered, can only be kosher as a Pesach if offered during the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. But how do we define proper time? But the question is do we define proper time as the entire 14th, the entire day, or just the afternoon? So as we pick up with the Mishnah on Yud Aleph Amud Bet, we address this specific question. So HaPesach sheshchato shachris ba'arba asar shelo lishmo. So again, you slaughter the Pesach offering, not for a Pesach. You think that you're doing it for some other kind of korban, and it's the morning of the 14th. So what's the story? So Rabbi Yoshua machshir ki'ilu nishchat b'shlosha asar. Rabbi Yoshua says the following: would it be kosher right now as a Pesach? No, and therefore we treat it as if it was the 13th. And just as on the 13th, if you offer a Pesach and you're thinking about an Ola, it turns into a Shlamim. So too, on the 14th in the morning, before when it would be kosher as a Pesach, if you bring it and you think about an Ola, it turns into a Shlamim. So
But you said before not. You said that it's not good for anything.
that's
Under
if
the
you do it
Pesach.
on the afternoon of the 14th. That's if
But
you.
but
This
but
is
the
this is
more
precisely the machlokas.
the
Let's finish it.
morning is Erev Pesach.
Let's get the other viewpoint. Let's get the other viewpoint. Ben Beseira posel ki'ilu nishkat bein harbaim, and Ben Beseira says it's not kosher at all. Again, you bring the korban Pesach in the morning of the 14th, and you're thinking about a shlamim or an ola. He says it's not kosher at all, and it's just like if you had done so in the afternoon of the 14th, because again, everybody agrees that in the afternoon of the 14th, then you're able to bring a korban Pesach. And if during the afternoon of the 14th you think about some other sacrifice, everybody agrees that that korban Pesach is going to be invalid and you'll have to bring a new one. So that everybody agrees with. The question is during the morning, when at least some people, and seemingly we'll end up concluding that everybody effectively says that it's not a kosher Pesach, do we say that that's shelo bismano? And therefore, when you have in mind the wrong korban, it's like bringing a Pesach in September, and you have in mind a korban ola, and all of a sudden that Pesach turns into a shlamim, and we say it's a kosher shlamim. So, do we say that that same thing happens in the morning of the 14th because you can't bring the korban Pesach as a Pesach at that time? Or do we say, no, once part of the 14th is valid for bringing the korban Pesach, we'll say that the whole 14th is going to be subject to that rule, that if you don't have in mind the right korban, it's going to be invalid. So that's the debate between Rabbi Yoshua and Ben Beseira. Rabbi
And when
Yoshua
would he
says,
hold that begins? Let's say Bena Shmashot the day before.
Bein Hashmashos on the 13th.
Right. Because there's a
Everybody agrees that that's going to be kosher.
Wow.
Everybody agrees that's going to be kosher. Bein Hashmashos on the 13th. If you brought it as a as a sacrifice, and you thought about it as an ola or whatever, or a chatas, it's gonna that Pesach is turning into a shlamim, and it's wonderful.
I mean, there is a discussion in other places regarding Beit Hashmashos, what day it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
ignoring the Bein Hashmashos piece, and I'm ignoring so maybe it's after the carbon tumid from Ben Arabayim, and therefore maybe you can't not allowed to bring it from that perspective. I'm going to ignore those issues for the moment. Right now, I'm focused on just the date. Does the date? Oh, Mark, they can use you downstairs. Do you mind? Okay. So that's the question.
Well,
That's
that
the
is the
question right
date.
now. It's all about the date.
That is the date. And let's say we daven Mincha and Marav early. So the date the next day is already, and it's still light out.
No, so even when you daven Marv early, that's a good question of do we consider it already like the next date? You can accept on yourselves the obligation of the next date, but if you daven Marv early, you can daven Marv early even on Shabbos, but that doesn't mean that it's now no longer Shabbos. It's still going to be Shabbos until, and the obligations of not doing work are still going to hold until nightfall. So the just because you daven or do a particular step doesn't mean that we treat it like the next day. We
Well, we
can
do it at Friday night, we do.
No, that's because we voluntarily accept upon ourselves the obligations of Shabbos. It isn't actually Shabbos. Now, there's the idea of Tosefes Shabbos, and we can
Right,
incorporate some aspects of that. But fundamentally, the whole idea of Tosefes Shabbos is that we're all adding on the observance of Shabbos when
right
it
now.
isn't Shabbos.
Right, I know.
I
So,
understand. So that's what I'm saying. So if you ask what day is it, it remains Yom Shishi. It remains Yom Shishi. I'm observing Shabbos, but it's Yom Shishi. So that's at least the way I understand it. So okay, so that's argument number one in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yoshua says if you do it in the morning of the 14th, it's like doing it on the 13th. And Ben Beseru says no, if you do it in the morning on the 14th, it's like doing it in the afternoon of the 14th. And that's the debate. So that's debate number one. Now the Mishnah turns and offers us a new viewpoint in connection with the debate that we had in the opening Mishnah. Again, the opening Mishnah said that every offering other than a Pesach and a Chatas is going to be valid if you offer it not for its own sake. So, in particular, you bring an Ola, you think Shlamim, it's still going to be a kosher Ola. It won't fulfill your obligations to the extent that you have a personal obligation to bring an Ola, but it is still a kosher sacrifice. We're now going to hear a viewpoint that disagrees with that. Amar Shimon ben Azai says, Mikubal ani mipi shivim ushnayim zakin. I received the tradition from 72 sages. Note that it says zakein, not zakenim. We'll get to that in the Gemara. Biyom shahoshivu es Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah biyeshiva. On the day that they returned Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah to his head position, or they put him into the head position, i.e., as the Nasi. This is discussed in Masechet Brachot, Daf Kaf Zayin and Kaf Chet. So Shekol HaZevachim. So what did I learn on that from all of them at that moment? Shekol HaZevachim HaNe'echalin, that all of the sacrifices that are edible, okay, and what does that exclude? It excludes the Ola. That's not edible. Nizbechu Shelo Lishman Ksherim. For the edible sacrifices, if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice, it's going to be kosher. Ela shalo mishum chova, but it doesn't fulfill your obligation. There's no difference between this opinion of Shimon ben Azai and the position that we saw in the prior Mishnah with respect to the fact that it doesn't fulfill your obligations completely. Chutz min haPesach umin haChatas. The only exceptions are a Chatas and a Pesach, where it's even though those are both edible. Chatas is of course only edible to Kohanim, but they're both edible, and those are going to be completely invalid. So what do we see? The lo hosif ben Azai, but all that ben Azai is adding, Ella ha'ola. He's adding the Ola. That effectively the Ola is also not going to be kosher. V'lo hodu lo chachamim, but the chachamim did not agree with him. So we had two basic points in our Mishnah. Point number one is about sacrificing the Pesach in the morning of the 14th and having in mind another sacrifice. Do we say it's kosher as a shlamim or not? And then the second is Ben Azai adds Shimon Ben Azai adds a new position that we hadn't seen before in to our debate, to our discussion in our opening Mishnah. So now let's go first through Ben Beseira and Rabbi Yoshua. So the Gemara first explains Ben Beseira's position. So let's take a look, and we'll begin with that Gemara. So, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Oshia, Makshir Haya Ben Beseira BePesach Shishchato Shachris BaArba Asar Lishmo. That actually the reason that Rabbi Elazar says that it's kosher, when you offer the Pesach not as a carbon Pesach and you have something else in mind in the morning of the 14th, the reason that it's invalid and that we don't say that it's a kosher shlamim is because at that time, in the morning of the 14th, you could actually bring the carbon Pesach. The kula yom is zimnehu, that the entire day is considered the proper time for a carbon Pesach. Umay ke'ilu. 1 second though, let's look at the language that Ben Beseira used, because he said ke'ilu nishcha ben harbayim, that it's as if you brought it in the afternoon. So why does he need to say that? So I need to Amar Rabbi Yoshua Ki'ilu Amar Ihu Nami Ki'ilu. No, the point is that he's not being precise in his language. He's rather utilizing the parallel language to Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua says that it's as if he brought it on the 13th. And so Ben Beseira is saying, listen, even according to you, it's as if he brought it on the 14th in the afternoon. So ihaki adamifle b'shalo lishmo lifklu b'shmo. Well, 1 second. If what you're telling me is that Ben Beseira actually says that bringing a carbon Pesach in the morning of the 14th is kosher, why not tell me that Ben Beseira and Rabbi Yoshua disagree about that? That Rabbi Yoshua says bringing a Pesach in the morning of the 14th, lishmo, meaning as a Pesach, it's not kosher. And Ben Beseira says bringing a carbon Pesach in the morning of the 14th is kosher. Why not tell me that law? So no, if I were to tell you that law, that in fact bringing the carbon Pesach, that they debate about bringing a carbon Pesach in the morning of the 14th, hava amino aval b'shalo lishmo moli Rabbi Yoshua leven Beseira. I wouldn't know that Rabbi Yoshua would actually say that the Pesach is that when you bring the carbon Pesach as an ola in the morning of the 14th, that it turns into a kosher shlamim. I wouldn't know that, because I would think that Rabbi Yoshua would agree with Ben Beseira. Since part of the day is appropriate to bring the carbon Pesach, and so I would think that as a result, the entire day we're going to say that if you bring a carbon Pesach as something else, it won't be kosher. Kamash Malan. That's why our Mishnah had to go out of our way and specifically tell us the debate when the Pesach is offered not in the not as a Pesach in the morning of the 14th. So Vahaksiv ben Arbayim. But 1 second, in Sefer Shmos, Perek Yudbet, Pasuk Vav, the Chumash itself says that this is supposed to be, the carbon Pesach is supposed to be brought Ben Harbayim. What is that supposed to mean? Doesn't that mean in the afternoon? So Amar Ula Braid the Rav Eli Ben Shnei Aravim. No, it means between two Aravim, 2 night times. One nighttime is that night, and the other nighttime is the end of the night before. So it means all day. That's how we're going to interpret this according to Rabbi Yoshaya. So Tamid, 1 second though, and once you now have given me that interpretation of Ben Arbayim, Tamid Diksiv Ben Arbayim, the afternoon Tamid, which we say is supposed to be brought Ben Arbayim, Hachinami Dekula Yom Kasher. Are you telling me that according to Rabbi Oshia, we would also say that it's kosher to bring the Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim all day? We know that that's not true. Hasam midiksiv es keves echad taseva boker. There in Bamidbar Parak Kavchet Pasuk Dalit, it says that you bring the first one lamb that you do in the morning. Miklal to Bein Harbayim Mamish. So the implication of that Keves Hasheni Taseh Ben Harbayim, the implication of Ben Harbayim is that it means the opposite of Boker, which means that you take it literally, which means the afternoon. So well, one second, maybe the requirement is to bring one in the morning, and the other one you have all day for, because after all, you just told me that Bein Harbayim means all day. So no, echad baboker. The pasuk that we just quoted from Bamidbar says one in the morning. Below shnayim baboker. So the implication is that we don't offer two in the morning. So therefore, the second tamid must be brought in the afternoon. All right. So fine, you've addressed the question about Tamid and how it says Ben Arbaim. But we've got some more, because Neiros Tiksiv Ben Arbaim. When it comes to the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, it says that you need to, and in the Mishkan, it says that you need to light the candles Ben Harbaim. So Hachinami Dekula Yom Kosher. So are you telling me that it means that you can light it all day? We know again that that's not the case. No, shiny Hassam. No, there we know it's different, because Diksiv May Erev Ad Boker. When is the light supposed to be lit? It's supposed to be lit from the evening until the morning. Vitanya May Erev Ad Boker. And so, as we have a brisa that says, why does the Torah tell us May Erev Ad Boker? Tain la midasa. It's in order to tell you how much oil you need to use. It's got to be able to have enough oil that it will last from the evening until the morning. Davar acher, or alternatively, the other thing we could learn from it, ein lecha avodak sheira me erev ad boker elazu bilvad. That what does it mean me erev ad boker? That only this service can be done from the evening until the morning. Every other service has to be done during the daytime. So the bottom line is, whichever way we take this, in the end of the day, you need to do this service during it's clear that this service needs to be done in the afternoon. And so even though Ben Harbayim technically could mean all day, because of this Me Erev Ad Boker, we're going to say that it really means that it's got to be done in the evening. Okay, so what about Ketores? So, all right, so you've addressed the Tamid and you've addressed the menorah, but we've got another reference to Bein Harbayim. Ketores Diksiva Bein Harbayim. We also say that when it comes to the Ketores, there's that Ketores that you bring in the morning, and then there's a Ketores that you bring in the afternoon. So doesn't that show that you also can bring it all day? Hachinami Dekula Yom Kasher. No, shiny Ketores. No, the Ketores is different. The Itkish Leneros, that we connect it to the lamps and to the candles, to the menorah. And just as the menorah is lit in the afternoon, the Ketores needs to be burned in the afternoon. So Hasam Nami Ksiv Sham Tizbach as Pesach Ba'arev. But 1 second, you have used the excuse that Bein Harbayim in those other cases cannot mean all day, because there are other psukim that give you a time frame. But now I'm going to point out that that time frame also exists in connection with the Karban Pesach. Hasinamik Siv Sham Tizbach as Pesach Ba'arev. You should when it comes to the Pesach, you should slaughter it in the evening. So again, doesn't that show that you shouldn't do it in the morning? No, hahu liucher davar hu da'asa. Nah, that's just telling you that if in fact you don't do it in the morning, well then you need to delay it in the afternoon. Titania, as we have the following brisa, yeuchar davar shenemar bo ba'arev uvein harbayim. That when the thing that we say, namely the Karban Pesach, that thing that we say about it, that it should be brought in the evening and it should be brought in the afternoon, that should be delayed. That should come after the thing that we say that it should only that only references Bein Harbayim. And what is that? That's the Karban Tamid. And so what this teaches us, this is a brisa that we saw during Maseches Psachim as well. The point is that this teaches us that a Karban Pesach needs to be brought after the afternoon Karban Tamid. So even though usually nothing happens after the second Karban Tamid, there's no more sacrifices on Erev Pesach. We that's when all the sacrifices get brought. That's when all the psachim get brought. So Omi ikar midi ilu shachat le mitzarfra amrat zimnehu kihimati bein arbayim imrat yucharhu dabar. 1 second though, this seems very strange because you're saying that according to Rabbi Oshia, according to the interpretation of Ben Beseira, that when he says Ben Arbayim, it means all day. And so what you end up saying is that if you do it in the morning, great, you could do it anytime in the morning until noon. You can do it anytime. But as soon as it's afternoon, now all of a sudden you have to wait until after the Karban Tamid. That seems strange. Is there anything else that we have that there's something like that? And if we had more time, I would leave that for you to think as a puzzle. But the Gemara gives us the immediate answer. Now you can use this as a riddle for other people, but you'll now know the answer. Absolutely, there's something like that. Da'amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, halacha mispal shel mincha va'achar kach mispal shel musafin. That if you wait to do the musaf, if you wait to daven musaf until it is time already for mincha, then you know what you're supposed to daven first? You daven mincha first before the musaf. So even though the musaf can be done anytime in the morning, once it comes into the afternoon, you should delay it until after you've davened the mincha. So that's exactly what we have here. So that works out perfectly. So again,
that is an issue on Yom Kippur in places that don't have daylight saving time.
Interesting. Yeah, it's also, of course, an issue on Simchas Torah as well. Some places.
And Simchat Torah, that's right.
Yeah.
And Rabbi Linkser pointed this out 7.5 years ago. Most people don't know this halakha.
Yeah, that very true. It's actually interesting. There, when I was listening to Rabbi Rosner, he was pointing out that in fact, when it comes to paskening this lahalacha, that there are some who say that this only applies to a yachid and does not apply to a community. So the context that you are referencing, that we are referencing, both Yom Kippur and Simchas Torah, generally that's the concept of a community. And so even then, there's an idea that we may not want to confuse the community with it, because you're exactly right. Most people don't know this halacha. But the bottom line is that certainly if you're an individual, we would say that this would apply. And there's an interesting debate about whether it applies for a community. Okay, but the bottom line is at the moment, we have successfully defended Rabbi Yoshaya's interpretation that Ben Beseira would say that a Korban Pesach offered as a Pesach in the morning of the 14th is actually kosher. But now we're going
Gadola. You're talking about Mincha Gedola, right?
Correct. Correct. That if once Mincha Gedola time comes, now all of a sudden, if you have not yet daven Musaf, you should daven Mincha before Musaf as an individual for sure, and you should talk to your local Orthodox rabbi if you are in a community. Okay, so we're not, but as I mentioned, we're not done, and now we're going to get the final question that is going to tell us that in fact we need a different viewpoint from Rabbi Yoshaya. Ubein ha'arbayim. Bottom line is, what we now have is we've excused the Ben ha'arbayim references when it comes to both the Ketores and the menorah. And we've said that other psukim tell us that it means at night. So, but now the question is, Ubein ha'arbayim diksiv gabi ketoros v'neros lamali. But you now need to give us an explanation. If bein ha'arbayim means all day, now then when it comes to the Karban Tamid, in that one pasuk, we get the Echad Baboker, and so as a result, we can say that Ben Harabayim clearly doesn't mean Boker, because it says Echad and Boker in the beginning, so clearly it means that it's got to be something other than all day. But when it comes to the Ketores and the Menorah, why mention Ben Harabayim at all? Va'od, Heshiv, and moreover, now, of course, in a classic move by the Gemara, they now give us some additional information that really shows that Rabbi Oshaya can't be right. Heishiv Rebbe Tachas ben Beseira, L'divrei Rebbe Yoshua. Rebbe, on behalf of ben Beseira, answered Rebbe Yoshua. And when Rebbe Yoshua had said that that it's like the 13th, Rebbe responded, "Lo, amarta bishlosha asar." Can you really say that it's like the 13th? She'ein mikza so ra'oi. Part of the 13th is not fit for to bring the Korban Pesach. Tomar ba'arba'asar, can you apply the ideas of the 13th to the 14th? Because when on the 14th, shemikza so ra'oi, part of it is fit for the Pesach. So the im isa. Now, if in fact we say, like Rabbi Oshaya said, that the whole day is right, is good, kula roihu, it should be the entire day. So why is Rebbe responding that the part of the day is kosher? Now it's interesting because you could have said that Rebbe's just responding according to the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, that even Rabbi Yoshua should disagree. But that's not where the Gemara goes. In the end, they say, that's it. We're going to now find another interpretation of Ben Beseira. Ella Rabbi Yochanan, maybe that's why it doesn't say Tiyuvta, but in any event, Ella Rabbi Yochanan, now we get a new view on what Ben Beseira's viewpoint is. Posel Haya
What
Ben
do we
Beseira.
hold? What says Rebbe is then supporting him and saying that it
Rebbe was answering Rebbe Yoshua on behalf of Ben Beseira. And so he's supporting, yes, he's trying to support Ben Beseira. And he's saying, how can you Rebbe Yoshua, say that a Pesach offered for something else in the morning of the 14th is just like the 13th? The 13th is completely different from the 14th. The 14th, part of it is good, a part of it is kosher for the Pesach. So how do you know that it should be like the 13th? You can't say that. So that was the response.
Was he holding that all of the 14th would be kosher, even in the morning?
No, that the whole point is that he's saying that only part of it is kosher on the 14th. And so as a result, given that he's responding on behalf of Ben Beseira, it must be that Ben Beseira only says that part of the 14th is kosher. And so that's why we're now going to give Rabbi Yochanan's view. Elam Rabbi Yochanan. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan explains, Posel Haya Ben Beseira b'Pesach Sheshchata b'Arba Asar Shachris. Ben Beseira would say that a Korban Pesach offered during the morning of the 14th, even if you have in mind the Korban Pesach itself, is invalid. Ben Lishmo, Ben Shelo Lishmo. It doesn't make a difference whether you offer it for its own sake or for some as another kind of korban. It's going to be invalid. Hawil u'miktzaso ra'oi, because part of the day is kosher, so therefore we're going to say that the whole thing is not kosher. And we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of Ben Beseira. We paskin like Ben Beseira, and we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of Ben Beseira. Namely, that if you were to offer another korban in the morning of the if you were offered a korban Pesach with him having in mind another korban instead, it would not be kosher on the morning of the 14th. Okay, so
but if you offered it for the Shem Korban Pesach, would it be kosher?
No, it wouldn't be kosher for that either, because only in the afternoon is when you can bring a Korban Pesach. So Megadif ba Rabbi Abahu. So Rabbi Abahu was like surprised. Im Kain Pesach kasher leBen Beseira heki mishkachasla. Well, 1 second, according to Ben Beseira, through the viewpoint of Rabbi Yochanan, how can you ever find that you have a Korban Pesach that's kosher? Because id afrashe ha'idna, if I set it aside in the morning of the 14th, dachui mi karahu. If I were to bring it right now in the morning of the 14th, would it be kosher? No. Well, that means that right now, this Korban Pesach that I am setting aside is dachui. It's rejected. There is no way it can be kosher at this moment. It could be kosher in the afternoon, but I'm not in the afternoon right now. And so right now, it's not kosher. And Rabbi Yochanan says that once you have a thing that is not is rejected, it becomes dachui la'olam. It cannot come back. Ve'id afarshrinu me'admol. And if you say, oh, all right, so well, I'll designate it yesterday. I'll designate it on the 13th. And because it will be kosher on the 13th if I bring it having another korban in mind, so then therefore the holiness of it can attach and it's kosher and everything is great. But Nira nivinidkahu. It was appropriate. It could be used as a korban on the 13th, but as soon as the 14th in the morning comes along, it's no longer kosher because you can't bring the korban Pesach at this time. Now, according to Rabbi Yoshua, we don't have this question, because according to Rabbi Yoshua, in the morning of the 14th, if you have in mind any other korban, the sacrifice remains valid as a shlomim. So as a result, it's good as a shlomim, or it'll be good as a Pesach all the time. So as a result, it never gets rejected. But according to the way we just explained, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that we explained Ben Beseira's view, there's a moment in time when this korban Pesach cannot be sacrificed at all. And if it cannot be sacrificed, it's rejected. And if it's rejected, it can never come back. And so as a result, how can it be okay? So as a result, so Ella Amar Rabbi Abau, so Rabbi Abau says, you know what? Let me adjust what I said, that it has to be tehei la'achar chatzos. It's got to be that you wait to appoint your korban Pesach until the afternoon of the 14th. You've done everything. You've checked it out to make sure there are no mumim. You've done everything you're supposed to do. But you wait, according to Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of Ben Beseira, you're going to wait until the afternoon of the 14th. And only then do you say, this is going to be my korban Pesach.
Well, how is this practical? And I'm just thinking, because the market, the cattle farm, whatever, would be overwhelmed. People, all of them rushing there after Chatzot to take their animal to designate as Korban Pesach.
So
and
that
people aren't supposed to be working then, right? So
100%.
how are they going to get their animal? Even if
Great question.
As you said,
So
even if they get their animal and they say, well, I checked the mum and so forth, in their mind, they're thinking, this is my animal I'm getting for Korban Pesach, right?
Absolutely. So this highlights a couple of different points. One is, until it actually comes out of your mind, you can think this is going to be my korban Pesach, and it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be your korban Pesach. You have to actually say it in order for it to be your korban Pesach. That's point number one.
Say it to whom?
Say it out loud to the world. That's point number two is that, and then point number two is that you can therefore take the animal that you know you're going to appoint as your korban Pesach, and you can set it aside several days ahead of time in order to check it and make sure that it's kosher, and you can and set it aside. And so as a result, when the Torah tells us that they set it aside 4 days earlier, or whenever, the whole concept of
Yetziat
Shabbos
Mitzrayim.
Hagadol and etc. can become one potential sources associated with this. But the bottom line is that when you take the korban Pesach a few days early, you're not, according to this, saying out loud that it's going to be your korban Pesach and the korban Pesach of your group, but rather you know that it's going to be your korban Pesach. You just don't say it out loud. So that's answer number one. Rabbi Abau says that it just has to happen in the afternoon. Abaye says, Abaye Omar, afilu tema mitzafer. No, you could even say it in the morning. Why can you say it in the morning? Because even though it's technically not kosher at this very moment, ein mechusar zman lebo bayom. As long as you're doing something on the day when you're supposed to do it, we're not going to say that we're going to treat the first part of the day, even though it's not kosher if you bring it then, we're not going to treat that part of the day differently. And Rav Papa goes one step further, and he says, Rav Papa Amar, afilu tema me'orta. You can even say the night before. And Laila ein mechusar zman, and because the nighttime is not considered premature, it's not considered as if you haven't done it, because we have a brisa that highlights this exact point, the Tani Debei Rabbi Yishmael. It was learned in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael. Leil Shemini. And so again, we know that an animal, I think Charlie touched on this topic in some of his questions the other day, that the animal cannot be brought until it's 8 days old as a sacrifice. Cannot be brought as a sacrifice until it's 8 days old. So Leil Shmini, the night that it becomes 8 days old, Nichnas Ladir Lehitaser. You can put it into the pen in order to take Meiser Behema. You can already move it into that pen in order to do the counting of every 10 animals. The Kedir Rabbi Apturiki, and it's just like Rabbi Apturiki, who says, to Rabbi Apturiki Rame, he points out a potential contradiction in a single pasuk, right? This is a pasuk. 1 second, I realized I didn't scroll. that Rav Avturiki points out the following in Vayikra Parakaf Bet Pasuk Kav Zayin. It begins with the following. It says V'haya shivas yamim tachazimo. It should be 7 days under its mom. So halayla chazi. So on the night of the 8th day, everything's fine. But then the next words in the pasuk uchsiv umiyom hashmini v'hala yeratzeh. It's only good from the 8th day. So that's the halayla lo chazi. That implies that the night of the 8th is not good. So how do we square this circle or circle this square, whatever you want to say? How do we fit this and make those two halves of the pasuk fit together? Laila l'kedusha. No, you can sanctify it. You can consecrate it at night. The yom lahartzah. But if you want it to actually be accepted as a korban, then you have to wait till the daytime. And so that's what the pasuk is telling us. And so as a result, this highlights that even though you can't bring the korban at night, you're allowed to set it aside at night. And so those are the three opinions that we would have. And so the bottom line is according to all three of these views, according to the way we effectively paskin, the bottom line is that you wait. And this also addresses the issue that we've seen before, that we have to be careful that if you set aside a Pesach and then it runs away, you end up with an extra Pesach and it's not good. So the bottom line is that it's very, that one in general should wait till one gets to the Beis Hamikdash and only then set it aside and say that this is going to be your animal as a sacrifice.
Okay. It's pretty unlikely for it to run away once you brought it to the Beit HaMikdash, right?
Yes, that's the point. That's my point. That's why it's a good strategy. Wait until you get to the Beit HaMikdash to set aside. Don't set it aside back in, wherever you live, in the Shtachim, wherever, in all the different places of Israel, in the Tzafon, in Rome, wherever you live. If if you got your flock, don't say that you are setting aside the animal as a sacrifice until you get it all the way to the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so Amrle Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Abahu. So Rabbi Zera now asks Rabbi Abahu on this last point. Lema kasava Rabbi Yochanan bale chayim nidchin. Well, 1 second, what you're saying under your approach is that Rabbi Yochanan would tell us that even a live animal, even though it's still alive, and therefore, and it's got no mum on it, you can make it so that it can never be a korban? That seems strange. I wouldn't have thought that. So Amr Lay and Rabbi Abahu responds back, you got it right. To Amr Rabbi Yochanan, we have the following statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Behema shel shnei shutafin. If you have two partners owning one animal, Hikdish chetzia, and one owner consecrates half of it. V'chazer v'laka chetzia v'haktisha, and then he goes and he buys the other half. Kedosha ve'ena kareva. It is a holy animal, but it can no longer be offered as a sacrifice. V'oseh tamura, and it's holy enough that it can be a tamura, meaning that you can say, I want it, instead of this animal, I want it to be that animal, and you end up with both animals having the same kedusha. Utamura saka yotziva, and in fact, the tamura would be just like it, meaning that you cannot offer it on the base on the altar.
Didn't we learn that you can't have tamura for shutfim?
Correct. We're gonna because you're absolutely right that you can't have tamura b'shrutim, but we have to focus exactly on the words here, because what did the other guy do? It wasn't that the other partner sanctified his half. Then you would be right. Then you would say there should be no tamura. But the chazar v'laka chetzia v'hiktisha, the first guy buys the other person's out, and so as a result, it's only owned by one partner at the end of the day. And so that you're exactly right. You're absolutely right. Can't do tamura if you've got partners, but here it's no longer partnered, and so as a result, you can do tamura. And we learn three different things from this. Shmamina balechayim nidchin. So first thing is that we learn that a living creature can become permanently rejected and not being able to be offered on the altar. Ushmamina dichli miikara hava dichli. And second of all, that even though it was never fit to go on the altar, because the moment that you sanctified it, it was half sanctified and therefore couldn't go on the altar. And therefore, or at the moment that it was fully sanctified, it couldn't go on the altar. And even though it was fully sanctified and can't go on the altar, it's considered fully rejected. Because you might
Why?
have thought that the
Why can't
only
it go on the
time that
altar?
something could be rejected is if at least at some moment in time it was actually kosher for the item. But no, even if it was never kosher, it can be fully rejected and never again possible to be unrejected, to be acceptable. Ushma mina, and number 3 thing that we learn as we turn to Yud Bet Amud Bet, yesh drichui bedamim. That also there's the whole concept of rejection, that an animal that is sanctified can somehow be rejected from being brought on the altar, that can apply to something that you sanctified only for the purposes of money. That I might have thought, well, you sanctified it for money. What does that have to do with the altar? So, because after all, they're going to sell the animal and then it should be kosher. But the point is that when you sanctified the animal half and half, it becomes dachloi legamri, and even though now you're going to sell the animal and use the money for for the bedek habayit, that animal is not going to be you're not allowed to bring that animal on the mizbeach.
Now, why is that? Is that a gezerah to katuv, or why is it once he sanctifies half of it and later the other half?
Because it wasn't all sanctified at one time. I
Well,
don't
where's that? What's
actually.
the source?
That's a
What's the
good question.
makor?
I don't. You ask a great question. I am not sure why. Apparently, there's a Gemara in Chulin, which we haven't yet studied together, that specifically notes that if only part of an animal becomes consecrated, it cannot be brought upon the altar because the rest of it is unconsecrated. And so as a result, even though later it now becomes fully consecrated, it's not valid for a sacrifice because the original consecration failed to make it fit for a sacrifice. So actually, apparently Rashi tells us that over here as well. Rashi gives us that Ve'ena kriva. So take a look at the last Rashi on Yud Bet Amud Aleph. Howel ubetchilas hakdasha lo nira lahakriv dechetzia haisa chulin. Since half of it was chulin, therefore, of course, you can't offer it on the altar because you can't offer chulin on the altar. And so as a result, it's been rejected from the very moment of its initial holiness. Who hilkach ein a kriva od? It can no longer be brought. The tera'eh, and therefore it needs to be sent out to graze. The lochin b'dameh acheres, and then you can use its money to buy another korban. So that's the point is that, and that's how we prevent it from accidentally going to the
Beit HaMikdash in the future.
Because what we do with it is we go and we send it out to a pen that will end up ensuring that it gets a mum, and so that's how we will make sure that it is okay.
I'm just wondering what the makor is. I mean, just because.
So no, the makor is that you can't bring chulin to the Beis Hamikdash. That's
so it's only partially,
but
it's only partially hektish, partially in the beginning.
Exactly, because it's partially hektish. Yeah, if you were to bring it, you would be bringing chulin to the Beis Hamikdash. So that we don't do that, and so that's exactly the proof. So thank you for the question. Thank you Rashi for being help that Rashi is at all times. I'm sorry that I didn't have that Rashi marked to begin with. I probably should have. Okay. Amar Ula, and hopefully, God willing, in 7.5 years, I'll remember to mark. I have now marked it, and so hopefully, 7.5 years, it'll also be in my notes. Okay. Amar Ula, Rabbi Yochanan. So Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Achal Chele v'hifrish karban. So now that we've sort of referenced this concept of rejection, and so now the Gemara is going to talk about 3 cases of rejection. Okay, first it's going to give us 2 laws, tell us why it needs to tell us both of them. Then it's going to ask a question about the third, and we'll have an answer there. So Amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan Achol Chela v'Hifrish Karban. It was said, Ula said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Again, it's Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says that once it becomes dichoy, it's dichoy la'olam. So if we have chalev, and if we ate chalev, and then we set aside a korban for it, and then behamir das, and then the person who did all that abandons religion and becomes a mumar, v'chazerbo, and then he does tshuva. Well, remember, if he becomes a mumar, v'hamir das, Rashi tells us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5. I'm sorry, fifth line down in the narrow lines on Yobenu and Bet at the end of the line, v'hamir dat nidcha. It becomes a rejected korban, mikorban. It cannot be brought. Ba'kol shochtin, because we're going to see in Chulin, me'am ha'aretz prat lamumar. The Torah tells us that you can bring a korban from an am ha'aretz, meaning any regular person, but who can you not bring a korban from? Who do we not accept the korban from? A mumar. So now this korban became rejected. But the chazarbo, and now he did tshuva, so he's now wants to bring that korban again. Hawel v'nidcha yidacha. Since it was nidcha, since it was rejected, it remains rejected. So itmar nami Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Abahu. We also have another statement Rabbi Yochanan that was also said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Achal chalev v'hifrish karban. You set aside you ate just one word, ate chalev, and then set aside a karban v'nishtata, and then you went insane. V'chazar v'nishtapa, and then you got your sanity back. Hoa v'nidcha yidacha. Since it became rejected, it remains rejected, and you need to bring a new korban. Utsrichi, and you know what? We need to tell both of these laws. And if this sounds familiar, it's because we've seen this Gemara before. Because if I told you only the first law, mishum dehu dachi nafshe biyadayim, that's because you affirmatively chose to be rejected. And so maybe if it was involuntary, maybe we would say that you don't, that the korban is not rejected. Where it happened on its own, maybe it's like a sleeping person, and just as a sleeping person doesn't have their korban rejected, so too a person who became insane, he just became insane. It was the natural process that happened within his brain. And on the other hand, if you had told me just the case of insanity, well, there he has no ability to fix it. But now, when it comes to the tshuva case, because he became a mumar, he does have the ability to fix it. So aim alone, maybe when you can fix it, it wouldn't be dachle lagamri. So tzrika. Therefore, I need to be taught both cases. So
who has it? We said the person recovers from his insanity. So who fixes it?
No. That he fixes. The point is that you can't guarantee that a person fixes it. When it comes to a mumar, he can fix it on his own because he could do tshuva. The whole point is that if somebody who becomes insane can't just fix it on their own. That's exactly the point. Because the person who's insane doesn't have the ability to just turn off his insanity. So as a result, we're going to say maybe that's worse than a case of mumar.
So then someone has to help him to fix his insanity.
Correct. Or just Hashem has to fix it. The point is that he doesn't have the ability to turn it on and off as at his as he wishes. This is before the medication necessary to address certain psychological issues. But even
there are plenty of people who suffer from bipolar depression. If they take their medication, they can be normal. It's relatively normal. But if they don't, then they can really.
Correct. This is, like I said, that's why I said
many of these people.
This is before the existence of such medications, so that we don't have the ability to say, well, let him just take his medication. Because obviously, if that were the case, then maybe we could say that even the person who has some level of insanity also has the ability to repair it in his own power. But the bottom line is that clearly we're understanding this in the pre-medical age. Obviously, if it's post-medical age, you'd have to ask a shaila as to whether or not maybe you might say something different. But the bottom line is that in both of these cases, either you couldn't control it in the beginning, even if you could control it in the beginning and the end, even if it was within your control, we're going to say it's still going to be problematic. So
Well,
by
I mean,
Lithium
in the
was
modern
probably
era,
known.
I might consider dementia rather than insanity.
yeah,
If
yeah,
it,
I hear that. I hear that. Yes, Charlie, go ahead.
Lithium was probably known in ancient times.
That yes, but that's more for depression than true. At least my understanding. You guys are both
sure.
much more knowledgeable in medical fields than I am, but that's less so for somebody who actually because remember that the insanity that we're talking about is somebody who really has no ability to have a sense of knowledge. That's why I think there's something to Kenneth's point that maybe it's talking about dementia. So all right, but in any event, now we have these two cases, and by Rebbe Yirmi asks about a third case. Also, chaylev v'hifish carbon. You set aside chaylev. I mean, you ate chaylev, and one ate chaylev. We're not going to say you. One ate chaylev, and then you set aside a car, and that person set aside a carbon. V'horu based in shechaylev mutar, and then the based in taught that chaylev is actually kosher. And of course, as we saw in Horios, that was in a mistaken teaching. V'chazru v'hen, and then they went back and corrected their teaching. But at the moment that they taught it that it was kosher, then all of a sudden that carbon became nidcha because you can't bring a carbon any longer because we said that if one were to eat chalev after the Beis Din, after the Sanhedrin rules that chalev is permitted, you don't bring a carbon chatas. So now this carbon chatas becomes unnecessary because Ruvahen, and again the Beis Din, the Sanhedrin retracted its ruling. So mahu mi havi dachloi. Do we say that it's retracted or lo havi dachloi? Because on some level, these are both things that are not in your control and could be fixed. And so as a result, so Amarle Hahu Saba, so a certain elder said to Rabbi Yirmiyah, Ki Pasach Rabbi Yochanan b'Dechuyan, that in fact, when Rabbi Yochanan began his discussion about rejected sacrifices, Meha Pasach, this is the case that he talked about first. My timer, why did he discuss about this one first? Hasam Gavra Idchi. In those other cases, the problem is with the person bringing it. He was a mumar. He was clinically insane. So in those situations, it's the problem that was the problem, not the korban.
Person that was a problem.
Thank you. The person that was the problem. Thank you. The person that was the problem, not the carbon. Carbon lo idchi. The carbon wasn't in and of itself a problem. Hacha carbon nami idchi. But here, the person is specific. The carbon is specifically the problem, and so that's why he's taught this law first. And in fact, that's the halacha. So Rabbi Shimon ben Azai mikublani mipi shivim shnayim. So now we go back to our zaken. That when we go back and quote our Mishnah, that Rabbi Shimon ben Azai taught the second law in our Mishnah, and he said that I got a tradition from 72 sages. So what did he mean by 72? Why did he use the term zaken? As Rashi says, Lama li lemisne zaken. As the Gemara asks, Lama li lemisna shivim ushnayim zaken. And Rashi says, Lisne Zakenim. It should have said Zakenim. Why did it say Zakim? Because all of them were of one opinion. They all agreed. All right, let's see if we can get ourselves to the.
What did they agree on? What was the halakha? That it was not chai.
That they all agreed that, in fact, when it comes to an ola also, if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice, it's going to be invalid completely. So lo hosef ben Azai ella ha'ola. And the Mishnah told us that all that Ben Azai was adding was the ola. Rav Huna, my time of the Ben Azai. What's the reasoning of Ben Azai? So answer, we're going to give three approaches. The first one's going to be rejected. The other two have potential to them. Ola hu isha reich nichach lashem. That it's an ola. So he lishmak sheira. It has to be itself. It has to be an ola. It has to be intended as an ola. Shelo lishmak psula. And if it's not, it's going to be invalid. Well, asham namik sivehu. As we've seen several times already through this Masechet, the asham also has the word hu. No, that's not going to be a problem. Ha'ula acharak taras. That was written after the burning of the sacrificial parts, and the sacrificial parts are not a necessary component of a sacrifice, and therefore that who cannot teach us anything about the necessary parts of the sacrifice, namely the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the bringing of the blood, and the sprinkling and the throwing of the blood. Hi nami la'acharak taras a murim hu diksiv. So, but this one also, in connection with the ola, is also written in connection with the burning of the sacrificial parts. So no, trey hu ksive. It's written hu twice in connection with the ola. Well, one second, gabi asham nami trey hu ksive. It says hu by the ola, by the asham twice too. So that can't be it either. So Ella, so therefore we reject answer number 1 and we offer answer number 2. Ella ben Azai bekal v'chomer ma'isila. Ben Azai used a kal v'chomer. Umachatas she'ein. And we're going to see, of course, that as all these kal v'chomers turn into, it's really going to turn into a tzara shava. Umachatas she'ein a kolil. That when you comes to a chatas, it's not completely burned. Shchata shelo lishma psula. And yet, if you slaughter it not for its own sake, it's going to be puzzle. Ola shehi kalil lo kol shekain, and ola that is completely consumed should certainly become a puzzle if you have in mind the wrong carbon. And so the Gemara asks, 1 second, malachata shekain mechaperes. You can't bring a proof from chatas. You can't bring that kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer requires that the second item be always less strong than the first. But the chatas has a stringency that's associated with it because it's mechaperes, it atones. So maybe that's why it needs the right intention. No, Pesach yochiach. Pesach does not atone, and it requires intention, the right intention. And so as a result, that shows umala Pesach shekain zmano kavua. But 1 second, the Pesach has to be brought at a certain time. So it has that stringency. No, so chatas tochiach. So the sin offering will show that the chatas will show that we don't need to bring it at a specific time. V'chazar adin lo reizeh k'reizev lo reizeh. So again, hatzad hashavah shebehen shehin kadoshim, that you have these holy sacrifices. Ushchatan shelo lishman pasul, and yet if you slaughter them not for their own sake, they become pasul. Hafani aviola, so too with an ola shehi kadashim ushchata shelo lishma psula. So too, if you slaughter an ola and you have in mind another carbon, it won't be kosher. Well, mala tzara shavish ben sheyesh behen sad kares. But 1 second, they both have kares that's a component. And of course, an ola has no kares. Namely, a pesach has kares if you don't bring it. And the sin for which you did a shogeg of in connection with a chatas, also it has to be one for which you would be liable of kares. So as a result, that shows that there's a stringency by the carbon pesach and the carbon chatas that doesn't exist by an ola. No, Ben Azai, as we turn to Yud Gimel Amanav, tzad kares lo parach. He says that that's not good enough. And Rashi explains, the point is that the fact it's the nature of the kares in those two things, in the carbon pesach and in a chatas, are completely different. In the carbon pesach, it's about not bringing it. In the carbon chatas, it's about the sin that you did. It's completely separate from the carbon. You need to have the same issue be in connection with the same issue. It can't be two different concepts, that you're dealing with, and therefore, according to Ben Azai, he says that it's still that is not a good question. So
what are the concepts here, according to Ben Azai?
According to when it comes to the Pesach, you might have thought that both the Pesach and the Chatas involve kares, but the Pesach's kares is about failure to bring the korban. And there's no chatas for failure to bring a chat. There's no kares for failure to bring a chatas. And similarly, when it comes to the chatas, the kares that's involved is that you did something by accident, inadvertently, that would have, if you did it intentionally, would have resulted in a chatas. But that's not true with respect to the carbon pesach.
It resulted in karet.
What? And it would have resulted in
karet.
What did I say?
You said it would have resulted in a chatat.
Oh, thank you. That if you did it intentionally, it would have resulted in kares. And so as a result, and that concept, the fact that you did something else that has nothing to do with the carbon, but is triggering the carbon, and that involves kares, that isn't true with respect to carbon pesach. You have to bring a carbon pesach because you're Jewish. So those two, yes, they both have something to do with kares, but it's not a common nature of something to do with kares, and therefore that is not enough to undermine the Artzad Shava. So Asham Nami, well, 1 second, so let's ask a different question. Asham Nami Laite, well, based on Ben Azai, that you're learning from Pesach and Chatas to an Ola, let's learn to an Asham also. No, Asham parech. You have a question with respect to asham. Malat tzara shebeshben shekain yeshnam b'tzibur v'yachid. That when it comes to a carbon chatas and a carbon pesach and a carbon ola, there is a public component and a private component. You can do all of them as a public or private item. Now, you might be wondering, well, what about a Pesach? That's all a private carbon. But as Rashi tells us, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down in Rashi, in the narrow lines, it's the end of a Rashi. Kare like carbon sibor. Pesach, kare like carbon sibor. A Pesach is called a carbon sibor. Why? Keda amran beseder yuma, as we learned in Meseches Yuma, giving us an opportunity to chazer. Perekot siolo in Daf Nun Aleph Amid Aleph. Mishum deasi b'kinufa, because everybody, the entire community, the entire crowd is bringing the carbon pesach together. It's as if it was a carbon sibor. And so as a result, that's why we can cut off the asham and say, no, we're not going to learn to an asham. Because basically what we're going to say is that you need to be a kodesh and you need to be something that could be brought as an individual or as a community. And therefore, it applies to the asham, it applies to the chatas, it applies to the pesach, and it applies to the ola, but it does not apply to the asham. Okay, the ibayasema, or we can go drop all of that and we can say the following. Tzada kares nami park. We can even allow the tzada hashava to be undone. And what is the basis for Ben Azai? Ben Azai Gamara Gamir La. Ben Azai understood that this was a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, if we understand Gemara Gamir La that way, or it was a tradition. And how do we know that he said it was a tradition? V'hadakam Rav Huna kal v'chomer. But what's second? But Rav Huna. And so Rashi tells us how do we know that? Because if we take a look at the next Rashi, Gemara Gamir La mipi ayin bet zakanim kiditanan. As we saw in our Mishnah, he learned it from the 72 Zakanim directly. So lo v'hadaka amar Rav Huna kal v'chomer, and that which Rav Huna referenced the kal v'chomer. Why did he say that? Lo amra el lechaded ba talmidav. The reason that he said that was in order to stimulate, to encourage his students. And Rashi offers us 2 ways that it could have been encouraged him in. So let's take a look at Rashi lechaded talmidav, and then we'll conclude sheyikshu lo tshuva alab, that he wanted them to ask the question, hey, how is it a kal v'chomer? This kal v'chomer seems to be problematic because the chatas is provides atonement, and an ola doesn't provide atonement. And then you go back and forth. And so he wanted his students to go through that discussion. And so that's why he suggested that it was a kal v'chomer. Inami, or maybe the reason is sheyitnu libam liyot charifin lidrosh kalim v'chamurim. Or what he was trying to do is say, listen, I'm teaching you how you can try and come up with your own kal v'chomers me'elehen on their own. Keben Azai, you should do what Ben Azai did, and you can come up with your own kal v'chomers. And he's trying to encourage them to think for themselves. So either way, he's trying to get them to ask the right questions, or he's trying to get them to think for themselves. Those are both wonderful concepts to think and to have a teacher encourage. And sorry for not scrolling the last little bit. And so that brings us to the next Mishnah. We have been referencing offering sacrifices not for their own sake. But what does that precisely include? We've given the answer that it means slaughtering, it means receiving the blood, it means bringing the blood, and it means throwing the blood. But we haven't seen anything that says it inside. That's going to be the topic of the next Mishnah. But for that discussion, stay tuned for tomorrow's daf. Shabbat Shalom. I believe that we'll be back, tomorrow's daf will be taught after Shabbos on Zoom with Ellie, but keep an eye on your WhatsApp in order to be certain. Have a wonderful day and a Shabbat Shalom.
Tell me this, the point that we raised earlier with the korban, the issue with the korban is disqualified. Well, no, the question. There was the question where the korban versus the person, right? So the korban, there was the Beit Din had made a mistake.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
The chaylev was acceptable. So that chaylev, they decided, paskin, that it was okay to eat that.
Correct.
So,
and so as a result, because they paskin that, now anybody who's eaten chalev is no longer obligated
No longer
to
obligated.
bring
That was
to
in
bring
Horiot.
it. And so as a result, exactly based on Hariot, and as a result, this carbon that it was set aside is now itself no longer a valid carbon. And so as a result, the carbon itself has a problem. So unlike the other cases where the problem, the fundamental problem
Right.
was with the person, that we won't accept a carbon from this person, and so therefore the carbon's not valid. But here it's the carbon itself that becomes
It
invalid.
becomes invalid because it's not necessary. Is that it?
Correct, because it's not necessary. Exactly.
So there's no pasul in the carbon itself. I mean,
Correct.
it
Well,
can't
no,
be
I mean,
used because it's not necessary. So can this animal, it's a kosher animal, right? Can it be used for something else?
yes. I mean, what you would do with it, right? I believe that you would,
Can they sell it?
I think, well, you have to let it develop a mum. So the question, 1 second, it's a chatas. It's a chatas. I can,
But why is it a chatat? Because
well, it's a chatas because it was just for a chalev. Remember, they set it
right,
aside for a chalev. So the
that's
question
it's
is
not
what
chalev.
I
But
can't
according to them,
remember.
it's not chalev, right?
What I can't remember is there off sometimes when you have a chatas, the result is that you have to let the animal die. You cannot
Right.
you can't do anything else with it. So I'm not sure whether this animal would have to be let to die, meaning you have to just close it up and it effectively starves, or whether you have to, or whether you can let it develop a mum and then say, right, because
But the question is, I'm at why is it a chatat? Why is it a chatat? The Beit
well,
Din
because he
say
set it
to,
aside originally as a chatas
well, why?
because he had chalev.
But Beit Din said that it wasn't essentially it wasn't chalev, it was mutar. So why
Right, but he had set it aside before the Beit Din said it was mutar. He
would he
just
even
never.
do that? Well, how did
Well,
he even come to it? I mean, they thought, what's the sequence of events? The guy, he goes to Beit Din, can I eat this? They said, yeah, you can eat it.
no. That's not the sequence of events. You're absolutely right. Then it would be very confusing. The sequence of events is he went to is he had a piece of meat. He thought it was
Shuman,
shuman. It turned out it was chalev. He's now obligated to bring a chatas. He sets aside the chatas, and then all of a sudden the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim says, you know what? Chalev is actually kosher. That particular kind of chalev that you ate, it turns out that that was kosher. And so he's like, oh, great, I don't have to bring my chatas. Now, I'm pretty sure that this chatas is not like the chatas where the person dies. Where the person dies, I'm pretty sure we have to let the animal die. But I
right?
think this chatas we would probably let graze. But again, I'm not 100% sure of that. So my apologies that I don't know that. But the bottom line is that and if that's the case, we would let it graze. It would go to a special farm essentially that would wait until it develops a mum, and then it could be sold, and the money that it was
Right,
used for would be used for olot on the mizbeach when the mizbeach isn't busy, and
right.
the animal that would now have been sold could be slaughtered and eaten, and that would be a kosher animal.
It could be for shlamim, so whatever.
Yeah, for anything, exactly.
But still, what you're saying, I think, is that he eats this and then he learns it's chalev. How does he know it's chalev? Who tells him? Someone tells
That's a
him.
situation that's his wife comes to him and afterwards and said, did you just eat the piece that was over here? And she says, yes, of course. It was a piece of shuman that I put there. And the wife says, no, I threw that shuman out. This was the piece of chalev that I was taking to throw out and put into recycle or whatever.
Okay, but then he brings it to Beit Din and he gets a pasak. No, that's not chalev.
No. That doesn't happen. Somebody else brought the psak. Obviously, if he brought that question to Beis Din and then they said that you're not chayav, he would never have set aside the carbon chatas. It's only because he says, "Oh, I know the halacha. I need to bring a carbon chatas." So he sets aside the carbon chatas on Monday. On Friday, there's a big announcement in the newspaper. Can you believe this Sanhedrin? They just ruled that this kind of chalev is kosher. And he's like, oh my gosh, my lucky day. I don't have to bring my chatas any longer. And he's thinking to himself, well, now what do I got to do? And so he has to. So the answer is that he's no longer subject to the chatas. So the chatas needs to be put into the special pen in order to develop a mum, and then when it develops a mum, so then he could sell it, and you
Okay,
bring
I
the
understand
oil
that
with the
part,
mum.
but didn't we discuss in the Gemara? There was a section there in the Mishnah, and then the Gemara that suppose this fellow is a Talmud Chacham and he's a mumcha, and he himself knows it's Caleb. There's a disagreement there whether he knows that he may be obligated in a chatat because he's even more. He knows more than Beit Din, let's say, and he knows so he's obligated, right?
Yeah, well, so that was a question. If he was part of the Beit Din, then we'd have that issue. But I don't think that if he's just a stam guy and knows that the Beit Din made a mistake, that's sufficient to be obligated.
I think
But
that was
if in
part of that
fact,
discussion.
what?
I think that was part of the discussion that he.
It may have been, but the bottom line is that obviously we're not dealing with that guy, because the point is that Rashi is telling us that at this moment he's not chayav in a chatas. He thinks that the point that the Sanhedrin has just exempted him from the chatas. You're right. If he thinks no, that they made a mistake, that's not right, I'm still obligated in the chatas, then maybe the law would be different. But we're dealing with a situation where he thinks that he's exempt.
Uh-huh. And okay, and now Beit Din retracts and no, we made a mistake, but he's still not
Exactly.
obligated
Exactly.
because at
And
the
so no,
time Beit Din
now
gave the
he's
Pesach.
obligated anew. He is obligated anew.
He
He's
is.
obligated to bring it. But now, well, actually, that's a good question. Now that they caught the mistake, the question is
Uh,
he would be covered by the sin
right, because
offering,
it happened
by
at the
the carbon that the community brings. So you're
okay,
absolutely
right. So, but because he got the Pesach at the time when he thought he Beit Din gave him a Pesach that he shouldn't be obligated now if they retracted. At that time, it was kosher, quote unquote, because
correct.
Beit Din
Correct.
said it was kosher, so he shouldn't be obligated in a chatat if they gave him a Pesach that it's a kosher animal.
Correct, correct. I think you're right that he would not actually, now that they were chazer, Bo, it would
Not
not.
his fault.
It's not his fault. Correct, correct. All right. Have a great day. Have a great Shabbos. Looking forward to continuing our learning together next week.
Okay.